that's class. Time to get to work. Today I'm going to make a 4-part mold of this bowling pin. I'm intentionally using this old one for my mold subject because I want my mold to have all the dents, dings, scratches, and detail that this particular bowling pin has. This mold is going to have 4 main parts. There will be a hard outer shell and a soft inner lining made of silicone. The hard shell will be made from resin, fiberglass mat, and fiberglass cloth. I'm going to start by making the hard outer shell first. I begin by cutting out the shape of the bowling pin in this piece of styrofoam. The styrofoam is a little less than half the thickness of the bowling pin. Next, I cover the bowling pin in a layer of clay that is about 1/4 of an inch thick, as well as place a layer of clay of a similar thickness on the styrofoam. The clay on the bowling pin is just a placeholder for what will eventually become the silicone liner. The clay on the styrofoam will allow me to make registration dimples for the resin hard shell. The strips of clay along the top and on the sides of the bowling pin are for making sure that the resin shell and the silicone liner will line up properly. Generally, something round, like the size of a ping pong ball, would be good for making registration dimples. However, I started this project without thinking ahead. Fortunately, I was able to improvise, and I found this tool in my shop which had a nice round backside. I started by coating the clay in a layer of resin, making sure to fill in all the dimples. After the clay was coated in resin, I started adding fiberglass cloth and mat. After I built up a layer of cloth on the flat surfaces, I then placed cloth over the corners and edges of the clay. Now that this layer of resin has hardened, I'm going to clean up any sharp edges and open up any air pockets. The flange of the hard shell needs to be very thick, very strong, and securely attached to the rest of the shell. The flange is going to be the part that bolts to the other half of the shell, which means it's going to be getting the most abuse compared to the rest of the mold. So I need to build it up with many layers so it'll be very robust. Since this mold is going to be around for a long time, I figured, why not make it fabulous? Also, I'm a grown man. This is my shop, and I can do what I want. And I want to make it look pretty. I added some glitter to the final layer of resin, so it'll sparkle. Unfortunately, I mixed a little too much resin for this, and a lot of it dripped off the sides. Next, I need to remove the clay from the flange, as well as make sure not to disturb the bowling pin and the clay that is set into the hard shell. Now I repeat the process on the other side of the bowling pin. With one exception. I don't need to place any clay to make a flange, because there already is a flange. The mold release will keep the two halves of the resin flange from fusing. At first I had a little trouble getting the resin to stay on anything that had the mold release on it, but once I added some fiberglass cloth, it wasn't a problem anymore. Again, I build up layers of resin and fabric on the flat surfaces before I cover any corners or edges. On this side of the hard shell, I had a bit more trouble when it came to keeping bubbles from forming underneath the fiberglass mat. When doing these projects, I learn as I go. I feel like I made this half of the hard shell a little nicer than the first. For this side of the hard shell, I decided to use this cool looking blue or turquoise glitter. I also mixed up a little less resin this time, so not as much would run down off the sides. Even though some resin dripped over the side and stuck the two halves together, a quick cleanup and everything should come apart. I did a quick once-over to check for any sharp edges or pointy bits that might cut or hurt me in the future, and I ground them down. Oh, thank goodness, it didn't get stuck together. Before I clean out the clay, I'm going to drill the holes that bolt the two halves together. I tried to glue some washers directly onto the resin with some 2-part epoxy glue, but unfortunately, it didn't work. I think my glue was old, as well as I didn't scuff up the washers beforehand. Either way, most of them ended up popping off. Next, I need to clean out all of the clay and prep the hard shell for making the silicone liner. I needed to drill a hole in the middle of the shell to be able to have an opening to pour the silicone. The last bit of prep work to this side of the hard shell is to clean up any sharp edges and smooth everything out. All ready to go. Next, I need to prep the other half of the mold. I need to clean any remaining clay off of the bowling pin, otherwise it would end up being a part of the final casting. Then I smooth out the remaining clay and use my carving tool to cut a registration groove into that clay. I traced out the stripes with a permanent marker. The ink will be picked up by the silicone, and later I can use it as a guide to make stripes on my castings. I'm only going to mix part of the amount of silicone that I need for this step. I'll explain why in a moment. I'm going to brush a thin layer of silicone onto the bowling pin before I bolt the two halves of the hard shell together. The thin layer will cause any bubbles in the silicone to pop, and I should end up with a smooth bubble-free layer that's closest to the bowling pin. Now I pour the silicone into the void that was created between the pin and the hard shell when it was removed from the clay. Because of the shape of the bowling pin, I have to do my first pour with the mold tilted up on one end like this. If I didn't tilt the mold, an air bubble would be trapped down on the small end of the bowling pin, and it would cause a major defect in the silicone liner. Next, I mix enough silicone to finish pouring the first side of the silicone liner. Now that the silicone liner has hardened for that side, it's time to finish up the other half. This is a bit stressful. I have to be careful to only drill through the resin and not to accidentally hit the bowling pin. Here's the moment of truth. If I'm lucky, the bowling pin didn't get separated from the silicone. Luckily, it's still in the silicone, and the side that released was the one with the clay. Next, I repeat the process of cleaning the hard shell, and I clean any clay off of the bowling pin and the silicone liner. I used some 2-part putty to fill in some voids in the resin shell. There ended up being quite a few defects in the shell. If I didn't fill them in and smooth them out, the silicone liner would get locked into the shell when it cured after being poured. I drilled a hole into the bottom of the shell so that I could make an opening to pour expansion foam into for when the mold is finished and I'm making castings with it. I'll use this wooden dowel as a temporary plug to fill in the hole that I just drilled. It will also connect with the bowling pin to make an opening through the liner. I sprayed a release agent onto the silicone so that the two halves will come apart. If I didn't, I would have a fancy bowling pin encased in silicone. I made sure to completely seal all the way around the dowel because silicone is, as I always say, very sneaky, and if you are not careful, it will leak out of a pinhole if you let it. Before I get to the fun part, I have to pour one last bit of silicone. When making the plug, I added some red pigment to the mix. I did this so the plug would stand out and be easy to identify compared to the rest of the mold. It was really in there. Turned out pretty good. This side was really hard to demold because the bowling pin is round, so there isn't really anything that I could grab onto to yank it out of the mold, but eventually I got it. And there it is. I have a 4-part mold of a bowling pin. So yeah, I kind of put this project aside for a long time and only came back to it recently to finish it. I made the mold a while ago, and then I put it on a shelf and didn't touch it for almost a whole year. To use the mold, I need to make a stand to hold it upright. Now that I finally got off my butt, and the stand is done, I can actually use the mold to make something with it for the first time. As the expansion foam was rising in the mold, I waited to put the plug in at the last second. Doing this will create back pressure because the foam is still expanding. The back pressure causes the foam to push itself into all the little corners of the mold. There they are. I spent a couple of days playing with the mold and I made a bunch of them. I hope you're as bowled over with the results as I am. It looks like I hit a strike on my first try. Alright, enough jokes. On with the video. My first one collapsed in on itself a bit, as well as I attempted to paint it. The collapsing is probably due to a couple of reasons. I probably didn't mix parts A and B properly, and I probably didn't use enough to fully fill the mold out all of the way. The paint also didn't stick to it very well, so the first one is kind of a dud. The second one came out a lot better. I used a bit more expansion foam this time, as well as I spent a little bit more time mixing everything thoroughly. Unfortunately, I dropped it and it got a couple of dings in it before I could take these pictures. The third one came out just as good, but I experimented with painting the mold first before pouring the foam. I like the way that this one came out of the mold fully painted, and the paint isn't covering up or filling any of the details from the mold. The fourth one is actually made from a soft foam. I am interested in making handheld props for haunt actors, and it seems to me like a good idea to put something soft into their hands instead of a real, hard, heavy bowling pin. Although, this one might still hurt a guest if an actor was swinging it around and it connected with their head, but I doubt it would knock anyone's teeth out. If someone were hit hard enough, it might give them a bloody nose, but an actor would have to try very hard to do any permanent damage. Lastly, this is another soft one. However, I attempted to paint the mold before pouring the foam, as well as I embedded a stick inside of it. Also, for whatever reason, the paint on this one is still tacky. I'm not sure to the cause of this, but I just wanted to make a note about how it turned out. This one hurts a little bit more because it's more rigid, but it's also unlikely to do any major damage to anyone. I'm aware that there are softer foams that I could use. This is just what I had available in my shop to do some tests with. Overall, this was a fun project, and I'm happy to have my bowling pin mold. This project has been on my mind for a long time, even before my nearly year-long hiatus from working on it, and I'm glad to have finally finished it. I do have some ideas that I would like to do to branch off from this project, such as using fiberglass cloth and resin to make castings with a hard outer shell, as well as an attachment for these so I can make half bowling pins. As always, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.